The Grand Canyon. Each year, hikers disappear, and in the last few months, the canyon has taken some lives. These tragedies are stacking up in places many call an unforgiving landscape. In this story, a retired park ranger writes in to give us his perspective about what's happening. When he worked at the park, he kept a notebook of disappearances and details of sealed caves, and one night came face to face with something not human. Watch this story and let me know what you think is happening. Welcome to Weird Encounters, a place where the ordinary fades into shadow and the unexplainable comes alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and become part of our ever-growing community of the curious. The Grand Canyon, a place of beauty, mystery, and disappearances. For decades, hikers have gone missing here without a trace. In this story, you'll hear from a retired park ranger who spent his career in the canyon. He kept a secret notebook of vanishings, whispered about the forbidden zone, and came face to face with something not human. This is his story. I am writing this because I have carried it with me for too long, and now that I am retired, I don't see the point in staying quiet. I worked for decades in Grand Canyon National Park. People believe they know that place, but unless you have been there in the dark hours, unless you have been called out to look for people who did not come back, unless you have carried bodies out of the gorge or stood at the edge of a trail trying to understand how someone could have disappeared without a trace, then you don't really know the canyon. Everyone hears about missing hikers. It is not a secret. People wander too far, they get overconfident, they underestimate the desert, and some of them do not make it back. But some of the disappearances cannot be explained by mistakes or bad luck. After a certain number of years, you begin to notice that there are patterns and that certain details keep showing up again and again. I started keeping a notebook. It was not official, and I never told anyone I was doing it, but I had to write the details down for myself. I wrote about the gear we found placed in strange ways, zipped packs with full water bottles left untouched, boots that seemed to step once and then stop, as if the ground had swallowed the hiker whole. Over time, the pages filled with cases that did not make sense. One of the first cases that stayed with me happened in 1993. A young man, early 20s. He set out on Bright Angel Trail. Witnesses saw him at Indian Garden talking to other hikers. After that, nothing. We searched for weeks. No trace. 10 years later, scraps of his clothing and one of his boots turned up 30 miles away in a gulch you could not reach without ropes. He had no ropes, and there was no sign of how he could have gotten there. It was not an isolated incident. In 1995, there was a German tourist. Middle-aged, good health, well-prepared. He was seen at Cottonwood Camp. Later, his tent was found on a shelf far from the trail. It was perfectly pitched, his bag rolled, his gear placed neatly, but there were no tracks around it. None at all. It was as if the tent had been lowered into place. He was never seen again. In 1998, a woman in her 40s who had hiked the canyon many times before went down South Kaibab Trail to the river. She signed the register at Phantom Ranch and then vanished. Days later, her pack was found on a ledge above the river. The water inside was still half full. Everything zipped. The boot prints leading to the edge stopped cold. The report said she must have fallen into the river, but we searched downstream for weeks. No sign of her was ever found. In 2001, a father and son camped near Nankoweap. The boy was 14. He walked just a few yards from camp to collect firewood. His father said he turned his back for less than a minute. When he looked again, the boy was gone. The flashlight he carried was on the ground, still lit. The wood he had gathered was stacked next to it. There were no tracks beyond that point. Search teams combed every inch of that canyon. Nothing. The father sat in the station afterward, repeating the same words. He was right there. By 2004, 3 college students from Arizona State went missing. They camped near the Little Colorado. One of them stepped into the brush at dusk. The others said they heard a low humming sound, like distant machinery. They searched with their headlamps. His tracks went 20 yards and then stopped. The young man was gone. In 2010, there was a prospector type who often came through the park. He claimed he had found carvings in caves and tunnels that went on for miles. He told us the government knew about them and was keeping them secret. We dismissed him as unstable. Weeks later, his truck was found near a restricted section. The key was still in the ignition. Strange markings were scratched into the dirt nearby. His disappearance was removed from the log a few days later. Cases like these began to overlap with what the older rangers whispered about: the Watchers. The first time I heard the term was in the late 1990s. A ranger named Dale said it under his breath after we found the woman's pack above the river. He said, "The Watchers got her." Nobody asked what he meant. Nobody laughed. The Watchers were said to be tall figures seen at a distance, standing on ridges or in shadows, too still to be people, too tall to be animals. You would look again, and they would be gone. The air would change when they were around. Birds would go silent. Radios would cut out. Some rangers said you felt them before you saw them. I saw one myself near Hermit's Rest. It stood on a ridge above me. I reported it, but by the time another ranger looked, it had disappeared. I was told it must have been the light. I knew it was not. The sightings matched the areas where disappearances clustered: Phantom Ranch, Horseshoe Mesa, Nankoweap, and those same areas matched the restricted zones on old survey maps. We called it the Forbidden Zone. The Forbidden Zone was not marked on tourist maps. You would only know about it if you worked there long enough. Caves sealed with rebar gates, warnings about collapse or contamination, entire canyons marked as closed. None of it ever made sense. I never saw any signs of collapse, and when I asked about contamination, I was told not to ask again. In the 1900s, there had been newspaper articles about giant skeletons discovered in canyon caves. The stories were denied and erased, but many people believed the Smithsonian had come and taken whatever was found. Others said there were ancient tunnels and chambers still hidden. During my time, I saw helicopters fly into those closed areas at night. Men unloaded crates, dressed in black, no markings, no Park Service patches. Once near Quagant Butte, I watched 3 of them open a sealed cave. They carried cases inside. They were gone for about an hour and came out without them. The helicopter returned, picked them up, and the gate was locked again. After that night, I told a coworker what I had seen. He shook his head and said, "Don't go looking where you're not supposed to." I began to believe the Watchers and the disappearances were tied to whatever was inside those sealed caves. My Navajo coworker, Joe, told me the canyon was a place where worlds met. He said sometimes they were here, sometimes not, and you could feel it before you saw them. He said that was why people vanished. Not lost, not fallen, taken. By the mid-2000s, I was certain something was active in those areas, not just wildlife or bad luck, something else. Then came my own encounter in 2008. We were searching Tanner Trail for a missing woman. On the second night, I split off from the team to follow what looked like tracks. My radio went dead. A few minutes later, I heard voices. It sounded like people moving ahead of me, but when I called out, there was no answer. The sound stayed just out of reach. When I turned a bend, I saw it. It was crouched near the rock, pale and thin. When it rose, it was taller than any man I had seen. Its limbs bent in a way that was not natural. Where eyes should have been, there were only dark holes. The voices I had heard were not from its mouth. They were in my head. Not words, but strong impressions, hunger, curiosity, and a feeling that it was in control. My light began to fail. The batteries drained within seconds. The figure stepped forward slowly. I turned and made my way back toward camp. I could not see it following me, but I knew it was there. When I came back into camp that night, the others looked at me as though I had seen something I could not explain, and they were not wrong. My clothes were torn, I had blood on my hands and knees from falling in the dark, and I could not speak clearly for some time. I told them I had gotten disoriented when my batteries failed. That was true in a sense, but it was not the whole truth. I lay awake for the rest of the night, staring into the dark. I kept waiting to hear the voices again, but they never returned. What I could not shake was the way the thing moved and the way it had been in front of me one moment and behind me the next without a sound. I did not imagine that. There was no way I could have misinterpreted it. The next morning, I checked my flashlight. The batteries were completely dead. New batteries drained flat after only minutes of use. I put fresh ones in, and the light worked fine. That was the first time I realized whatever I had seen could affect physical things, not only people. I also realized that night that I had not simply been scared. What had happened to me was more than fear. It was interference. The voices in my head were not my own thoughts. They were put there. They were not speaking in sentences, but they were controlling the way I felt and the way I reacted. That is something I have heard in other reports, but never admitted to officially. Rangers would come back from searches saying they thought they heard people calling for them, sometimes loved ones long dead, sometimes their own names, sometimes voices of children. We dismissed those reports as fatigue or stress. I do not believe that anymore. I believe whatever I encountered, and whatever the watchers are, they can influence the mind. They can make you see things that are not there, and hear things that are not real. That is why so many people vanish without explanation. They are not wandering off trail by mistake. They are being led. They are being lured into places they should not go. After my encounter, I began reviewing my notebook with new eyes. Cases that had seemed odd but explainable no longer looked that way. Hikers whose packs were found zipped up and stored neatly were not simply confused or panicked. They were being directed. Boot prints that ended in the middle of a trail were not people turning back or walking on rock. They were being taken. When I looked again at the areas where people vanished, they overlapped with the sealed caves and the forbidden zone. Those caves were not simply closed for safety. They were closed because they connect to something we are not supposed to find. The Watchers, or whatever they are, come from there. I cannot prove it, but I believe it. I remember one cave near Marble Canyon. It was sealed with a gate welded shut, but even standing near it, the radios would cut out and compasses would spin. Birds would not land anywhere close. I asked a supervisor once why it was sealed. He stared at me for a long time and finally said, "You don't want to know, and you don't want to ask again." That was the end of the conversation. There were also times when men who were not rangers showed up after unusual cases. They wore plain clothes, sometimes carried clipboards, and asked for files. Once in 2005, after a disappearance near Hermit's Rest, 2 of them came into the station. They asked for search logs. When I hesitated, one of them leaned in close and said, "You don't need to be writing down anything that isn't part of the official record." His tone made it clear this was not a request. After they left, I checked the report. Witness statements about strange lights were removed. Details about tracks that ended suddenly were gone. The official version said the hiker was unprepared and likely fell. That is what went on record. That is when I started keeping copies at home. The more years I worked, the more I realized there was a system for hiding these things. If a case lined up too closely with the forbidden zone, or if there were too many strange details, men would appear, files would change, and the story would become one of carelessness or weather. The families never heard the other details. The public never knew the real pattern. The Navajo I worked with had their own understanding. Joe, the man I mentioned earlier, said the canyon was a place where the world was thin. He said sometimes things came through. He called them Yi Naldlushi on occasion, but other times he said they were older and not the same as the beings described in their legends. He told me once during a long silence on a search, "They're not always here, but when they are, you'll feel it in your bones before you see them." That's why people vanish. Not lost, not fallen. Taken. I wrote that down word for word in my notebook. The folklore of the region is filled with warnings. Some tribes spoke of spirits that lived in caves. Some said they were guardians. Others said they were tricksters who misled people. I grew up hearing these stories in bits and pieces, but after my years in the park, I no longer see them as folklore in the usual sense. They are warnings that were passed down. As for what I believe the creature I saw was, I think it was one of the Watchers. I believe they come from the caves in the Forbidden Zone. They are not human, though they can mimic human voices in the mind. They are not animals, though they move with a kind of predatory patience. They exist in that thin place Joe described, between our world and somewhere else. I cannot say if they are spirits, interdimensional, or something left over from long before us, but they are real. I have asked myself many times what their purpose is. Are they protecting something? Are they feeding on people? Are they simply moving between worlds and we are in the way? I do not know. What I do know is that they have no regard for us, and when someone disappears near them, they are not coming back. That is why I retired. After my encounter in 2008, I stayed a little longer, but I knew I could not continue. I could not keep leading searches for families when I knew what might have taken their loved ones and still be forced to tell them it was heat stroke or a fall. I had given most of my life to the park, but I could not live with that silence anymore. I am writing this now because I think people need to understand that not all disappearances in the canyon are accidents. Something is there. Something tied to the caves and the Forbidden Zone. Something that can alter what you see and hear. Something that can lead you to make a mistake that is not really your own. I have seen strong men rattled after hearing their names called in the dark when nobody was around. I have seen volunteers nearly fall to their deaths chasing voices of people who were not there. I have seen equipment fail for no reason near sealed caves. These are not coincidences. They are signs that the Watchers are near. People need to be warned. If you ever find yourself in the canyon and you feel the air grow heavy, if the birds go quiet, if your equipment starts to act strange, turn back. If you hear voices calling you, do not follow. If you see figures on a ridge that vanish when you look twice, leave the area. Those are signs you are in their territory, and once you are there, the risk of disappearing is no longer chance. I do not know if the government is hiding the truth to protect people from panic, or if they are hiding it because they know more than they admit. I only know that the files were changed, the reports were altered, and the families were given answers that did not match what was really found. I have nothing left to lose by speaking now. I am old, retired, and I know what I saw. I am not the only ranger who has seen these things, but most will not talk about it. I am writing so there will at least be one account on record that tells the truth. In the end, I think the folklore had it right. There are things in the canyon that are not ours. Some say they are guardians. Some say they are tricksters. I believe they are both. They protect what is in those caves, and they mislead anyone who comes too close. That is why hikers vanish. That is why the disappearances repeat in the same places. That is why the Forbidden Zone is sealed. If nothing else, I hope people take this as a warning. Some of the missing slipped, some made bad choices, but others were taken. So what do you believe? Are these vanishings just accidents in a dangerous wilderness, or is something older, stranger, and hidden deep in the Grand Canyon responsible? Let me know in the comments. Daniel and Linda Harper, a husband and wife from Flagstaff, Arizona, thought they knew the canyon better than most. They were wrong. What started as an ordinary morning hike became a nightmare of lost time, sealed caverns, and something inhuman that seemed determined to keep them from ever leaving. This is their story. Hello, my name is Daniel Harper, and my wife is Linda. We're both in our late 50s and live in Flagstaff, Arizona. We've hiked all over this state for decades. The Grand Canyon has always been our favorite. We've raised our children taking them down the trails, camping at Phantom Ranch, showing them the landmarks we thought we knew by heart. After so many years, we thought we understood the canyon better than most. What happened to us last spring showed us we didn't understand it at all. We set out before sunrise. That's always been our routine. We like to start early, beat the heat, and have the trails mostly to ourselves. The air was crisp, the sky just beginning to glow, and we had our packs loaded the same as always. Water, food, first aid, maps, even a GPS unit. We don't take chances. The plan was simple. Head down a section of the South Rim Trail, eat lunch at a spot we liked, and come back up before the afternoon sun made the climb miserable. The first couple hours were normal. The sun crept up, the canyon walls lit in gold, and we were enjoying ourselves. We talked about our kids and grandkids, joked about how our knees weren't as good as they used to be. There was nothing unusual about the morning. But then things started to change in small ways. At first, I thought I was just tired. The trail didn't look quite right. The switchbacks weren't where I expected them. Linda said it first. "This isn't where we should be." I laughed and said we must have missed a landmark, but when I pulled out the map, nothing matched what we were seeing. The air felt heavier. It's hard to explain. It wasn't hotter, but it pressed down in a way that made me uncomfortable. The sounds were wrong too. The usual wind through the brush, the calls of birds, the scuff of our boots, all of it seemed muffled. Even our voices sounded strange, like they didn't carry. That was when we realized we weren't on the trail anymore. Neither of us remembered turning off. There was no clear fork, no decision to explore. But when we stopped and looked around, the dirt trail we had been following was gone. Behind us was nothing but scrub and jagged rock. Ahead was more of the same. And then we looked at the sun. It was wrong. Just minutes earlier, it had been high in the sky. Now it was dipping toward afternoon. We had lost 4, maybe 5 hours. Neither of us remembered a single step of that time. Our watches showed the hours had passed, but in our memory, it was like a blank slate. The realization made my stomach turn. I have been disoriented in the wilderness before. I know what it is to lose track of direction. But I have never lost hours of my life with no memory of what happened. Linda kept asking me, "Where did the time go? What did we do?" I had no answer. When we gathered ourselves, we saw we were in a place neither of us recognized. She later called it the Forbidden Zone when speaking to the rangers. At the time, it was just somewhere we shouldn't have been. There were caves, not natural openings, but entrances sealed with steel gates. Some had heavy rebar welded across, others had full doors bolted into the rock. Faded signs warned of collapse or danger. But here's the part that unsettled me most. Some of those gates weren't rusted relics. They were newer, fresh welds, bolts that still shone. Someone had been there not long ago. Around those caves we found belongings, a torn backpack strap lying in the dirt, a single hiking boot, cracked but not rotted, a dented water bottle with a sticker peeling off, a strip of flannel shirt half buried in gravel. These weren't ancient. They were the kind of things you'd expect from someone who had been out there within the last few years. We didn't touch them. We just looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. People had been here, and they didn't make it back. That's when the noises started. At first, faint. A whisper, like someone speaking just out of earshot. Then clearer. My name, then Linda's name. I thought maybe it was the wind, but the wind doesn't mimic voices. We both stopped and were listening. The voices called again. Linda went pale. She said she heard her sister's voice. Her sister has been gone for years. I heard my father's voice, even though he died a decade ago. The sound wasn't exact, but close enough to freeze me in place. Then we saw them. Shapes, moving in the distance. Not solid, not clear. Like shadows or heat waves rippling in the air. I tried to focus on them, but they blurred and vanished. When I looked away, I could feel them closer. Once, I swear I saw one stretch taller than a man before it flickered out. That's when Linda began to change. At first, she seemed distracted. I asked if she was all right, and she said, "They're showing us where to go." Her voice was flat, not her own. Then she blinked, shook her head, and begged me to help her. She said she didn't know where we were. Minutes later, it happened again. She stared into the distance, calm, talking about a path that wasn't there. Then back to herself, sobbing, terrified. Her eyes looked wrong during those spells, darker, unfocused, like someone else was looking through them. I gripped her arms, shook her, and she would come back, crying and clinging to me. Then it would happen again, over and over. We had no cell service. The GPS wouldn't lock. We had no way to call for help. Then we found carvings, simple marks scratched into stone, like arrows pointing in a direction. We don't know who made them, but they were the only thing we could cling to. We decided to follow them. We moved quickly, barely speaking. The whispers came and went. Sometimes it was our names, sometimes it was laughter, sometimes just nonsense words. Once, I swear, I heard Linda's voice repeating a phrase she hadn't spoken. Other times it was my own voice. The shapes flickered too, tall figures shimmering like heat. Sometimes they moved like they were walking parallel to us. Sometimes they appeared ahead, then vanished. Once, Linda tried to walk toward one. I pulled her back. She fought me, saying, "That's the way." Her voice wasn't hers again. When she came back, she collapsed and was shaking. At one point, she fell and refused to get up. She said she wanted to lie down and let it happen. I don't know what it was, but the way she said it chilled me more than anything else. I dragged her up, forced her to walk. For a while, she resisted, eyes blank, muttering things that didn't make sense. Then suddenly she was back, crying, begging me not to leave her. We kept following the carvings. Hours passed. The sun sank lower. Our water was nearly gone. My mouth was dry, my legs shaking. Linda stumbled often. I was half carrying her by the end. Finally, we saw a trail. A real trail, worn down by many feet. We didn't know which trail, but it was a path. We followed it upward, step after painful step. By the time we saw other hikers, the sun was near the horizon. They stared at us like we had come from nowhere. At the ranger station, we told what happened. We said we had been led off the trail without realizing it, that we lost hours of time, that we ended up near sealed caverns with belongings scattered around. We told them about the voices and the shapes and the carvings we followed to get out. They gave us water and told us we must have been disoriented. When I used the words "forbidden zone," one of them went rigid. He didn't ask anything else. We know what dehydration feels like. We know what it means to be lost. This was neither. We were taken off the trail by something we still don't understand. We lost hours of our lives. Linda nearly didn't come back. Since that day, she has had nights where she wakes up shaking, saying she hears whispers in the dark. I can't forget the way her eyes looked when she wasn't herself. We swore we would never go back to the canyon again. I don't know what's in those caves or what those shapes were. I only know there is something there. And so, another strange encounter fades away. A trick of the mind, or something far more unsettling. That's for you to decide. Thank you so much for watching my stories. Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your support is what keeps this channel going.